Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today we have special guest, Holly Gramazio. How are you doing, Holly?
I'm all right, thank you. And caught me catching my forehead despite the fact that you warned me exactly how it was going to go and when you were going to have me appear on the screen. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I also mispronounced your last name despite practicing with you, so we're even on that score. It's Gramazio, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Holly, you are a game designer, curator, and writer who's very interested in play in all of its forms, particularly how people play and public play. I was curious, what's the pathway to your interest in these things and to doing what you do?
It's one of those very convoluted things that comes from lots of different directions. But certainly I was always, the bossy kid in the playground who would stand on the bench and explain what everyone was going to do now and how it was going to work and go, oh, this isn't very interesting anymore. Let's try this thing instead. So in a way, it seems retrospectively like a predictable path. But also part of it just came from moving to London just as I was finishing studying and playing a game in public space at an impressionable time, and also finding that playing in this new city was a good way to feel at home there and feel like I was laying claim to the space in some way. It was sort of a shortcut to not feeling like a slightly out of place visitor anymore. So having those experiences at that time when I was looking around going, right, what do I do with my life now, was probably key.
And what is it about public space and play in public that does lead to that feeling of, either renegotiation of your relationship to the space or a sense of ownership in your case?
And I think some of it is just that it is an active assertion of your right to be there and do things and have fun. And part of it is that thing where brains are very, very easily tricked. And normally we only play when we're with friends and we feel safe and it feels like an okay place to do something frivolous and sometimes risky. And therefore, if we play in a place, then that kind of contaminates our view of that place. We're like, oh, this must be an okay place. This must be somewhere where I have the right to be, that in some sense is mine to mess around in.
And so that's a really powerful feeling. How do you actually design for that when you're on the other side of the equation, trying to let people, feel comfortable enough to play in a public space?
Yeah, that's a good one. It depends on the person a lot. Some people like to play in space in a way that feels actively transgressive and find that play that is obviously permitted and sort of endorsed by nearby authorities isn't satisfying or interesting to them. But mostly those people are already happy to play anyway, and they don't really need me to help them. So for people who don't have that feeling, having some sort of sense of officialness to it definitely helps people to feel licensed to take part. Like signs that are printed instead of being written on a bit of paper, right? Or scale of installation, or people with lanyards, or like someone going, oh, would you like to play this thing? And then giving you a ribbon to tie around your arm, or something that is both like a gradual way into play where you can watch the thing and understand what it is and understand that you can take part in it and if you want to, before you have to suddenly start doing it and potentially not understand what you're doing. But also make it clear that we've thought about it, that it's safe, and that people are unlikely to get in trouble for taking part. Also make it clear that it's intended for adults as well as children, if it is, because that's another really difficult thing. Lots of adults tend to see something playful and assume it's not for them. So figuring out ways to communicate that actually it is, whether that's having a few facilitators who are playing themselves, or having like things people can engage with at different scales, so that one is clearly for children, thereby implying that adults are allowed in the other bit, or whatever it might be. Even color palette makes a difference, right?
Right, and this is really interesting because these all seem like design solutions to make people feel more comfortable, to really indicate and give them authority and agency to step into that uncomfortable space of play where you're a bit vulnerable, a bit exposed, for the people who need it. And you're saying that for the people that don't, they're going to be playing anyway, so you don't need to worry.
I mean, very, very happy to have them join in, but I don't need to get quite so stressed about what the pathway is for them and how to sort of make them feel able to take that step into whatever the play experience is. Yeah.
And you mentioned, making people feel safe in the terms of like they can trust you, that you've thought through the issues. What are those responsibilities as a designer of public play?
Oh gosh, for very, very obvious ones, like do a good risk assessment and make sure that nothing's going to collapse and that you've tested all of the stuff that might go wrong. I think if you're asking members of the public who are just wandering by to join in, there's also a sort of a responsibility to have done enough playtesting that you're fairly sure what sort of experience you're offering them, or make it really clear when they join in that you're just testing something out, that it might not work, which is important for them, but also important for you as a designer. Like it's not much fun watching people very clearly try to pretend that they're having a nice time because you're right there and they don't want to have a discussion with you about how your game is bad, but also clearly your game is bad.
Yeah, that sounds really awkward.
Yeah. I think making sure that they're equipped to explain to other people what's going on if you're sending them out of your immediate sight. So something I've talked about a lot is the thing you give people that explains their behavior and that they can show someone else to explain their behavior, whether that's a silly hat or an armband that is like, oh, they're taking part in some sort of weird art thing, or a piece of paper which has, like if you're doing it at an institution, the institution's logo on it and the number of the organizer, so that if anyone's like, "Hoi, what's going on?" They can phone you and you can explain. And yeah, thinking about how the people playing will feel in the space and how they'll seem to external observers who haven't bought into the game. I think there's a big difference in people who make work in public space about how they feel about the way that non-players will encounter the work. I really hate it when people are cross at me. I'm very bad at dealing with that. And so I tend to err on the side of anyone who's in the area that's not playing, the worst thing they'll experience is a sense of faint exasperation. If they sigh or roll their eyes or take a photo and text it to their friends going, "Oh my God, look at what's happening in the square," that's fine. If they find their day seriously disrupted or whatever, then I'm generally not comfortable with that. I know there are makers whose work is much more about actively laying claim to and appropriating public space for other ends, where that kind of disruption is part of the point of what they're doing. And there's a lot of really interesting work in that area too.
It sounds like, practically speaking, you're very interested and invested in crafting a kind of invitation for people that doesn't, um, you know, transgress too many of their personal boundaries.
Yeah, I think so. And having spaces where people are actively choosing what they're engaging with and where they can step off if they don't feel like it anymore. It's important to me that people can see what they will be doing before they start doing it, for example.
And what's your broader interest in the way that people play? Beyond public play, I know that you've done almost ethnographic kind of like research and writing, documenting house rules at Now Play This, which we can talk about later, doing research on the floor is lava, which is the floor is piranhas or poison, depending on where you are in the world. Is this on purpose, this specific exploration of the ways people play?
I think I'm generally always very interested in the history of a space. And again, particularly since I moved to London, I grew up in Adelaide. Adelaide is one of those cities that feels like a small town where you walk down a street and you run into three people you know, and you meet someone else from Adelaide and you try to figure out who the person you know in common is. And every corner of the city was full of my personal experiences and memories of things that I had done there or that friends had told me they had done there. Then I moved to London, which is much bigger and much more densely packed with people, and I didn't have that sort of personal connection to specific spaces. So instead I set out to try to sort of replace my personal history with finding out as much as I could about the general history of the places. Like I was originally living in Battersea, quite near Battersea Park, and the first game of football played under Football Association rules was played there in, I think, 1851. I don't care about football, but like that's a neat thing to know. It made me feel more connected to the place to know that, if that makes sense. So always had a general interest in the sort of space-based history and place-based history, and so that definitely plays into my work. But more broadly, the history of games and how they're played, I think it's partly that, but I think it's also partly because people making games and using games as a communicative medium, as a kind of arts practice, is not something with a huge history, right? If you're a painter or a novelist, you can go, oh, well, so-and-so said this, such and such did that. There's a lot that you can look at over hundreds and hundreds of years to see what a lifetime of practice looks like. And in games, we don't have that so much. There's a bit of it. There are now people who've been working in games for 40 or 50 years, but we can't go, well, what was happening in the 19th century? The games that were invented then, either we don't know who invented them, or largely they're invented as one-offs, or they came out of poorly documented places, and we don't know what the deal was with why they were made and how they were made and how they fit into the wider life of their creators. So finding these bits of history and habit about how games have been played and how they've been transformed by the players can kind of fill some of that gap for me.
I really like that articulation of the interest of the history of games, because it does feel like we have folk games and traditional games that are embedded in culture, and then auteur games have largely been cemented using the language of industry and the evolution of technology, and so thinking about artistic practice and non-commercial games as its own history and having its own oral history that connects, maybe even bridges the two folk and industrial modes is a really nice approach. And earlier you were talking about wanting to know the local history of a new space, which was London for you. It certainly feels like you have deeply connected to the local games community there, as well as other arts communities. And you actually founded an entire festival of experimental game design that is based in Somerset House, one of the most iconic locations in London. Can you tell us more about why Now Play This exists and what it stands for?
Yeah, absolutely. So Now Play This has now run 6 times. It's a festival of experimental game design, which is a sort of articulation we came up with to mean it looks at games that are intended as, again, a communicative medium. It isn't particularly interested in specifically video games or board games or sort of interactive poetry or any particular area, but rather in anything that uses play as at the heart of what it's doing. And then every year we look at a different theme. So yeah, that's 6 years old now. It runs as part of the London Games Festival. In Somerset House, I directed the first 5 years with feedback, and I'm doing a lot of the digital curation during that. As of this year, it's had a new guest director, Marie Fulston, who had to very rapidly take it online in light of the pandemic, which seems very unfair. I had it for 5 years and didn't have a single pandemic.
I mean, just as a side note, I have to say that the way that Marie and the Now Play This team turned a physical festival that was all planned for into a digital event on such short notice and with such inventiveness and generosity of spirit was pretty incredible.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing to see. Also with at such a transition point as well. So V and I had both left. The production team, Sophie Sampson and Nick Murray and Joe Summers, who've been doing it for between like 3 and 5 years each, were still there and stayed consistent. So that obviously helped. But yeah, I thought it was extraordinary.
And so I'd like to ask what your principles or approach to curating both content and installation design was when creating Now Play This. I guess I'm personally thinking about the fact that it feels like a very wonderfully approachable event, and it attracts a much more diverse audience than the average games event seems to do. And so like, how did the choice of what to focus on, or like your choice of controllers or installations or even placards influence that, and how did you approach those things?
Yeah, interesting. When we set out, we decided to essentially behave as if the arguments that we were finding ourselves having to have had already been won, and assume that no one would be rude enough to query that. So we didn't try to convince anyone that games are an interesting cultural form that are worth examining. We just behaved as if no one would think they weren't. We didn't try to argue that like all sorts of people make games now. It's not just for white teenage boys. We just assumed that everyone accepted that and tried to proceed on that basis. And again, people usually didn't query it. We assumed that video games and board games and playful architecture and so on would have things to say to each other, and didn't try to sell people on that idea. We're just, here is the thing that is this stuff put together. These are the connections that we've drawn between them, which was both I think pretty successful as a way to proceed, and also just saved a lot of arguments, because whenever it came up, I could just say, oh, I don't argue about that. Like, as a policy, I don't have opinions about that, and move on. I would say in terms of diversity, although we, generally speaking, we get lots of people of all different genders. I would say in terms of like economic and racial diversity, we do better than a lot of game developer events, and we do better than a lot of arts events, but there's a lot of quite commercial, consumer-focused game events that draw a more diverse audience than we've ever managed to do along those metrics in particular, which I think in our circles, because these are mostly events where it's sort of big AAA games that are not really of interest to me, or I imagine to you, are shown. Like we don't tend to go to them or consider them when we're talking about game events, but there's definitely stuff that we could learn from them, and they're quite like they're very different approach that draws a different crowd to the ones that events like Now Play This tend to get.
This reminds me of like the larger context and questions of how to decolonize the arts in Australia. At least that's my local context, and I guess yours too now. Now that you're in Adelaide for the pandemic, and also like the way that arts has contributed to gentrification and the whiteness of the arts, just as a broad issue in at least Melbourne, and it sounds like in London.
Yeah, and I think like mainstream games is in some ways an incredibly inclusive art form compared to, for example, the opera or most fine art exhibitions, and that's something that is less well reflected in the artsier side of games sometimes.
What were the standout memories or moments of Now Play This for you?
Big events, their stand-up moments are always when it's over and it's too late for anything to go wrong. Having
as a previous co-director of a longest running festival of independent games, like I totally agree with you. But
like the very, very warm Now Play This, which you were over for, and just 10 of us messing around in the fountains in the middle of Somerset House at the end of that. Or I think the subsequent year, after everything had closed down, just 6 or 7 of us sitting on beanbags at the back of the area that was focused on game makers and playing actually the best thing with a controller that barely communicated with where it was set up at the front, and just lying on beanbags and arguing lazily and sleepily in a group over what the best thing was. And then at the end of 20 minutes, having collectively decided that the best thing was sunshine. And like that, those are really beautiful. Really lovely moments.
Just for context to the audience, I also didn't I think know about this happening, or I guess like I didn't hear it expressed in this very warm way. The Best Thing is a game that I made with Hugo McPhee, and actually I'm hoping to release really soon, where you choose the best thing by discussing, sometimes arguing maybe with your friends. It starts out with dialectic pairings, like do you prefer dogs or cats, which is the best thing, or summer or winter, and then later the rounds get very weird, like summer or dogs, which is the best thing. So you're doing this big bracket of 128 things until you get to the best thing, which in your case was sunshine after a beautiful festival.
Yeah, well, beautiful festival, grey days, and I think there was me and maybe 2 other Australians in the voting group. So
influenced the decision a bit.
Yeah.
Just to move on to, I guess, your design practice, and it does relate to curation as well. I noticed that your work is frequently quite explicitly political or pedagogical, whether that's games like Manifesto, where people literally put words together to create a brand new Dadaist manifesto, or Pornography for Beginners, which is a puzzle script game that responds to British pornography laws, as well as the work that you've done for cultural institutions and science museums. I guess I'm curious about, like, there's been a lot of noise in the past about the capacity of games to drive change socially, broadly. I don't particularly want to discuss that, but I'm interested in the way that you approach designing for these experiences, politically and pedagogically.
Yeah, interesting. Part of the reason that so many of the games I've worked on, and in the cases of Manifesto and a couple of stuff for science museums with my colleague Sophie as part of a little company, Maths and Marco, part of the reason so many of them have some sort of pedagogical aim is that education departments are the places that have, like, small to medium amounts of money and the desire to get people to actively engage with a thing. Like, no art gallery is ever going to decide that they want to acquire a thing I've made for their collection, right? And if they did, it wouldn't make sense anyway. But the education department might want people to be in a place together thinking about a thing or looking at the artworks in more ways. So that's where the possibilities to get paid to do it and get funding to make the thing and have access to the space and the audience tend to come up. Sometimes we get very, very particular prompts, which I try to steer away with from, because I do struggle with those sometimes. I remember trying to design a game that was about teaching 3 to 6 year olds to wash their hands more. And it was just too specific, just a week of staring at bits of paper going, ooh. But having a general subject area or a desired feeling or experience from visitors that we can work around, I find quite interesting and exciting as a prompt.
And how do aesthetics come into it? Like, your guiding principles for making design decisions. I guess we talked about that in the context of public play. Does that get refined or change when considering the political or the pedagogical, the educational?
Often when I'm making work, I'm collaborating with someone, and I think I can be quite frustrating to collaborate with sometimes, because I get
Why is that?
very caught up in all of the details, which is fine, right? Everything matters. That that little hollow feeling that you sometimes get, that's like, oh no, that'll be fine. Like, I try to look at that as a sign that something isn't going to be fine and that I have to direct my attention to it. And that can make it difficult for people that I'm working with to feel like they have the space and agency to do their own stuff without me constantly going, what about this? What about that? Oh, I'm not sure about that. So when I'm working with someone whose aesthetics I trust, I try very hard not to care about that. I could have an opinion on which of these fonts is better, but my opinion isn't going to be better than that of a trained designer. So if I can keep myself from having that opinion, then that's probably best for everyone.
I like that approach.
Yeah, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it very much affects the feel of the game experience, and in those cases, obviously I do care, and don't try not to care, but that tends to be things like, oh, which of these ribbons feels better to grab? Which 4 colours look good together, but are also distinguishable from each other if you're colourblind? That kind of practical side of things.
And I love the constant motif of those pragmatic questions coming to the fore. It sounds like you really pay attention to those details to create work that is often very subversive, sometimes pushing at definitions, often examining or breaking norms or considerations of what we think of as normal play, or recontextualizing and remixing. But even as it does all those things, it's incredibly approachable, accessible, inviting. Holly, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the Distillery to talk about your design practice and your curation. Yeah, thank you for sharing all those things.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really lovely chat.
A great pleasure. Take care.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you for tuning in, everyone. You're watching The Distillery, a series of online interviews. You can check out previous episodes on our website, distillery.site, or follow us on Instagram at distillery.site, or Twitter at distillery-site. Do check back because we have new episodes every day. And take care. Bye.